Hello and welcome in this second video in the series An Introduction to Music Theory. So in the first video we looked at the concept of pitch, how high or low a sound was. And in that first video I also referred to the fact that music is arranged in two ways. Firstly, we use pitch to determine how high or low a note is, and we use the subject of this video, rhythm, to determine when notes are played, at what point in time they're played, how long the notes are played for, what the gaps are between individual notes. So essentially music's arrangement over time. So as I said in the first one, and just to recap that, music is basically a series of notes played at a certain time in a very simple concept. We'll see more advanced concepts as we go on, but for now that's good enough for what we need to know. We're going to take a look at the stave that we presented in the first video, and you'll notice a couple of differences between the one we looked at in the first session and this one. The first thing is, you'll see that this stave has been broken up into sections by these lines, and in fact there's a double line at the end. The other thing that will be unfamiliar, or that we didn't see in the first video, is this concept here. This thing's called a time signature. We're going to come back to look at that in a little while. I want to look more at the types of notes we can use in music first, and this structure here. Why are we breaking things up into sections? Firstly, let's identify what these sections are called. So the gap between, in this case, the start of the music and this first line is known as a bar, or the Americans refer to it as a measure. And each of these bars is separated by something called a bar line. So bar lines are used to break music down into smaller component parts called bars. At the end, we have a special bar line. It's called the double bar line, written with a single normal bar line and then a thicker version after it. The double bar line simply signifies the end of the music, or the end of the piece. So as soon as we have a small 4-bar piece of music here, there's a double bar line on the end to indicate its end point. So as I say, I'm going to come back and explain the time signature in a little while. I just want to first of all look at the types of notes we have in music. I'm not going to look at all of them in this session, but enough to get us going, and explain a little bit about how they work. And I'll be referring to these note names in two forms. The first one is what's commonly referred to as the American system, which is mathematically based, and I find for certainly for my newer students, or students that I've been teaching using this method, I find their pickup of this is a lot easier. The actual naming of the notes goes a long way to describe what they actually do. But there is a traditional or European way of describing what these notes are called as well. I'll mention those words too, because chances are in other music education or other music texts, or in talking to other musicians, you may come across these terms. So the first one we're going to take a look at is the one that we actually saw in the first lesson. We saw these notes, we just didn't know what they were called. So I'm going to place a note on the stave here. Okay. So this note, which we identified from the first session as being F, remember that was the face, F-A-C-E. So we've placed this note on the F space. But what's important to us in this session is actually what this note looks like and what it signifies, not where it is on the stave. The rules for what I'm about to talk about in terms of the timing or the time of music relate regardless of where this note is on the stave. It doesn't matter where we put it. We're going to work with this space for the moment. Later on we're going to move between notes, just so it's easier to hear where the start of one note is and the end of the next note is, and so forth. But for now, let's just take a look at this. Okay, so this hollow open circle, this thing's called a whole note. It's also referred to as a semibreve, but we're going to talk in terms of it being a whole note. And when we say it's a whole note, what we're effectively saying is it takes up the whole bar. So this note here extends in terms of time to the beginning of the next bar. We are going to explain the time signature in more detail later, but I'm going to draw your attention to this top number to start off with. The top number signifies to us how many beats there are in each bar. When I talk about beats, I mean basically the way we count through the music. So I'm going to play this back to you now, and I'm going to count through it. You'll hear a click indicating where the beats are, and you hear that I will count up to 4 before this note stops. Let's just have a listen. 1, 2, 3, 4, off. Okay, so when we listen to that one more time in a minute, we're listening for 1, 2, 3, 4, off. When I say off, I mean that's where the note ends. So because this note is 4 beats long, it actually stops at the start of the 5th beat. Okay, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's the 4th beat. We carry on that note until the start of the next bar in this case. Just have a listen one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4, off. Okay, so in terms of this note's value, we refer to it as being a whole note. The other way of thinking about it is it's 4 beats long. Okay, let's take that one out for a second and let's replace this with another type of note. Okay, so I've put 2 notes in this bar now. Previously we only had the one. We're going to look at what these notes are. They're both the same type, and again, circular element, the note head, remember that's important for us for pitch. And in terms of rhythm, it's important as to whether this is hollow or filled in. So in terms of the last note, we saw the whole note was also hollow. Okay, this one here, 4 beats long, the whole length of the bar. But this one here, you'll see it's also hollow, but it has a stem attached to it. This note's referred to as a half note. It's also referred to as a minim. I prefer the half note. It describes its function completely, which is it's half a bar or 2 beats. Okay, remember we said this music is functioning using 4 beats per bar, and by having 2 notes in that bar, each one of these notes is 2 beats long. Now I'm going to shift this second note. I'm also going to get rid of that quarter note that we had before. So these 2 notes, I've shifted them. I've put one note on one pitch and the next note on another one, just so we can absolutely hear where one note ends and the next one begins. So again, I'm going to play this through and count through and have a listen. You will notice that each of these notes is 2 beats long. This one will be the first 2 beats, beat 1 and 2, and this one will be the second 2 beats, beat 3 and 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, off. Same idea as before. 1, 2. This note goes all the way up to the start of beat 3 because it's 2 beats long. We have to give it the full 2 beats, beat 1 and beat 2. It comes off at the start of beat 3 where this note takes over. 1, 2, and we have to go all the way through to the first beat of the next bar. That's where that note finishes because it is 2 full beats. Okay, so one more time just to have a listen to that. 1, 2, 3, 4, off. Okay, so that's the half note, or the minim. Let's go on one step further. I'm going to take those away and I'm going to replace them with these notes. And again, I'm just going to place these on separate pitches just so that it's easier to hear them when we play them back. Okay, so these ones are called quarter notes. Quarter notes look similar to a minim that we just had before. Circular element with a stem attached, except this time the circular element, or the head of the note, is filled in. And a quarter note essentially represents a quarter of the bar, or 1 beat. So when we're playing through this time, you'll hear that the note changes at each beat point because these notes are only 1 beat long. 1, 2, 3, 4. You'll have noticed there's a stem pointing in a different direction to this one. I'm going to come back and explain that in a second. Let's just take a listen first. 1, 2, 3, 4, off. And again, this note here carries all the way through to beat 1 of the next bar. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Before I look at this stem, let's just take a look at the notes we've looked at so far. Okay, so I'm just going to place a couple more notes back into this for a second. Okay, so let's just put and then we're also going to put the whole note that we had before back in the next bar. Okay. So as you can see, when we talked about this before in terms of what they were called, this whole note here, whole bar, half note, half a bar, quarter note, quarter of a bar. And you'll also see that these are divisions of 2 effectively. So this one was 4 beats, the next note we have available is 2 beats, the next note we have available is 1 beat. So we're dividing these by 2 each time. That's another reason I like to use the the American system of naming these notes. I just think it makes more sense. It's much easier for a new student to come to grips with how these notes actually function. Their function is directly in their name. The traditional way of referring to these quarter notes, by the way, is a crotchet. Okay, so in the traditional system or the European system, you'll hear that term crotchet. Okay, let's just quickly address what's going on here with this stem. We talked about with the quarter note that it has the head of the note, which signifies pitch, and the stem, and the fact that the note is filled in tells us it's a quarter note. And in this case, the stem's pointing upwards and it's coming off from the right hand side of the note. So there's the circular element, stem going up from the right. On this one, same thing, but the stem is going down and it's going from the left hand side of the note. You can really think about this is just this turned upside down. So if we turned one of these the other way up, obviously what we'd end up with is the stem going down from the left hand side. So why is it that this note has the stem pointing up and this note has the stem pointing down? Well, it's simply a matter of economy of space, really, is the main reason. So let's go on to look at that. The middle line on the stave is important in this case. If the note head is below the middle line, the stem will point upwards. If the note head is above the middle line, the stem will point down. If the note is on the middle line, it can actually go either way. It would probably depend on what the notes surrounding it were. So for example, in this case, because the two notes other side both have their stems pointing in the upwards direction, it probably makes more sense for us to continue that. It's just a more regular pattern and probably a little bit easier to read. But there's no reason why it couldn't be that. That's perfectly valid. This kind of thing you will see from time to time, but it's in unusual circumstance. So we're going to ignore that for the moment. We're just going to go with that simple rule. If the note head is below the middle line, the stem goes upwards. This applies to these as well, by the way. If I shift this note up, you'll see that its stem changes direction. So below the middle line, stem goes up. Above the middle line, stem goes down. On the middle, it can be either. It doesn't matter, both are valid. Okay, this is the only breakdown of notes we're going to use for this session. We can go further. As you probably noticed, this is a whole note, this is a half note, this is a quarter note. If any of you are thinking there's a note called an eighth note, you're right, there is. And there's a 16th note, and there's a 32nd note, and there's a 64th note. Some of those, when we get down to 32nd notes, 64th notes, are rarer. We don't see them very often. 32nd notes more than 64th notes, but not so much. But the concept is exactly the same. We just keep breaking the time down into smaller and smaller divisions. But for the sake of just getting a basic understanding of reading, basic understanding of rhythm and how we can put these things together to produce rhythms, we're simply going to stick with the quarter notes. On the next video on rhythm, which will be a couple videos down the line in this series, I'm going to look at some more complex examples of rhythm where we break notes down to being less than a beat long, and we use some other concepts which I'm going to come back to later. Okay, so here's an example where I've essentially filled up my 4 bars with a little melody, really. It is a melody because it has changes in pitch. I haven't really explained the concept of melody, and I'm going to come back to that in the next section when we look at more advanced concepts of pitch. But for the moment, you can essentially think of a melody as a series of pitches. So you see here I'm going from an F to a G to an A, back to a G, back to an F to a G, F, G, and finally back to F again. So we can think about this as being a melody. What we're more interested in is the rhythm that this thing produces. So in order to understand how to play this, we have to think about the count of each of these notes within their respective bars. So each time we get to a bar line, we restart the count of 4. Let's have a listen to this first. I'm not going to count to start off with, but I want you to see if you can count along with it. There is a metronome click that's going to accompany this, so you should be able to follow where the beat is. So try and think, as you're listening to this piece of music, try and think of those terms. 1, 2, 3, 4. Be counting through it. Count it out loud if that helps. Okay, here we go. Okay. A couple of things we'll see about this piece of music. Firstly, how many bars long is it? Well, it's 4 bars long. 1, 2, 3, 4. How many beats in total is that piece of music? We can simply work that out by taking the number of beats in the bar and multiplying that by the number of bars we have. So because we have 4 beats and we have 4 bars, we have 16 beats in total. But we don't count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on and so on. As I said before, we reset the count when we get to the start of each bar. So this time I'm going to play it through, but I'm going to count through with it, and then we're going to come back and explain why that count works the way it is. So let's just have a listen again. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Off. And again, same idea at the end here. You'll notice with that piece, that very last note, this is 2 beats long, this last note, but we have to play 3, 4, and we kind of finish the note as if there was a first beat here. So what the important point about that is, when we're talking about the length of a note or the length of a beat, is we have to give it the full value of the beat. So you can think about the end of one beat being the start of the next one. So in this case, 3, 4, off. That's where we'd release the note. Okay, so let's have a look at the count of this. Well, this one here is relatively easy. We know this is a whole note. So this note in particular must be taking up all 4 beats of this bar. So when we're playing this note, let's just play this section. 1, 2, 3, 4, off. So we'll see that that note occupies the full 4 beats of the bar. This one here, relatively straightforward as well. This first note is the first 2 beats, because it's a 2-beat note or a half note. And this note takes up beats 3 and 4, because it's a 2-beat note or a half note. So if we listen to this bit, 1, 2, 3, 4, off. Okay, and that note again ends on the first beat of the next bar. This one here, still not overly complicated. This first note takes up the first beat of the bar, beat 1. This note, the second beat. So both of these notes are 1 beat each, quarter notes. And then finally this one here completes the bar, beat 3 and 4. Listen to that one. 1, 2, 3, 4, off. Okay, great. So first beat, second beat, third and fourth beat. Finally this one here, this note here is the first beat, and it's 1 beat by itself, it's a quarter note. So this takes up the first beat, or occupies the first beat. This one's a half note, or 2 beats long, so it has to be beats 2 and 3. And then finally this one, the quarter note at the end, is beat 4. So if we listen to that one, 1, 2, 3, 4, off. Okay, so you probably see from those few examples there's a few different arrangements of the way we can place these notes. There's one thing that should become, or starting to become obvious about a lot of this stuff, is that this has to add up to 4. If we take the number of beats that are in each of these bars and think of them as a little maths equation, they have to add up to 4, because that's the top number in the time signature. So the top number of the time signature, everything that's in one of these bars has to add up to that number. 1 plus 2 plus 1. 1 beat plus 2 beats plus 1 beat. 4 beats. This one here is 4 beats by itself. It takes up the whole bar. 2 beats plus 2 beats. 4 beats. That's fine. 1 beat plus 1 beat plus 2 beats. It's the same as this really. We've just changed the order that those times appear. So 1 plus 1 plus 2 equals 4, and 1 plus 2 plus 1 equals 4, but it's the same idea. So that's an important concept, and it's actually a rule of music notation. It has to add up. So that sort of explains what happens if we have a piece of music where there is never any breaks in it, and that's not always the case. Quite often we're going to have points where a note isn't played. In this piece of music there is no space. It's a consecutive series of notes. One note leads straight into the next one. But I'm going to delete a note, and I'm going to start off by deleting this one here. Okay, so first of all that note's gone, but you'll see it's been replaced by something. Okay, this symbol here indicates a rest, and a rest is effectively the opposite of a note. The count still exists. This is still beat 4. It's just that we don't play a note on beat 4 anymore. So this symbol here is referred to as a quarter rest, or a crotchet rest if you're thinking in the old system. So in terms of a quarter rest, in exactly the same way as a quarter note is 1 beat long, a quarter rest is also 1 beat long. So I'm going to play the first couple of bars of this exercise back again, and you'll now hear that we have a gap. 1, 2, 3. On beat 4 this note stops, and there is a whole beat's rest before we get to the start of the next note. Let's just take a listen. Okay, so you hear that on beat 4 this note finished. So this was beat 2, beat 3, beat 4, that note finishes. There's complete silence until we get to the first beat of the next bar. One more time and I'll count it this time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Okay, so you can see that at that point we had a complete rest. And as I say, this symbol here is a symbol for a quarter rest. There are other types of rests. In fact, there is a rest that corresponds with every type of note that we've looked at today. So I'm going to do another one. I'm going to get rid of this note here. So this is a half note. I'm going to delete that note, and you'll see it's replaced with a different symbol. Okay, so this thing here looks like a little brick that sits on the middle line, indicates a half note rest, or a rest of 2 beats. So in exactly the same way, here's my first 2 beats, 1, 2. This is my beat 3 and 4. It's just that we don't play anything on those beats. So the same rule will apply. This note, 1, 2, the start of the third beat, this note will end, and then there'll be 2 complete beats of rest before we start this note on beat 1 of the next bar. I'm going to play it back from this point, just so we get a bit of a lead into it. So we'll have this note for 4 beats, this one for 2 beats, 2 beats of rest, and then into the final section. Okay, let's have a listen. And so on and so on. Okay, this time I'll play it through, I'll count through this time as well. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Off. Okay, so this here is our half note rest. We're going to take this note away now. Okay, so now we've removed that note. We can see we have a very similar kind of rest to the one we had for the half note, being that it's a brick symbol, but this one hangs down from the 4th line. So a half note rest sits on the middle line pointing upwards. A whole note rest hangs from the 4th line pointing downwards. And this just indicates 4 beats of rest. We're not going to play anything for the 4 beats. One thing I am going to do is I'm just going to put back the quarter note that we had here before, just so that this rest is a little bit more obvious. Let's just have a listen to this. I'm going to go from the start. When we get to this point, you'll notice there's a full 4 beats of rest before this next note comes in. Okay, here we go. And so on. We'll do it again, this time counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, and so on. Okay, so we can see that we have different notes that represent different timing, different lengths of notes, and we have rests that equate to them. We just delete this note again so we can see the quarter note rest. So here's our quarter note, here's our quarter note rest. Here's our half note, here's our half note rest, here's our whole note rest. I'm just going to remove this section at the end here and put another whole note into that section just so we can see it. Here's another whole note at the end. So here's our whole note, here's our whole note rest. Remember that difference between the 2. Half note is the middle line, sitting on the middle line, sort of pointing upwards. and the whole note is hanging from that fourth line, pointing downwards. Now this is of course not a complete set of rhythmic values we can use in music, but it's a start, and it's where we're going to end this first session. So this was just designed to give you a very, very brief introduction into the timing of music and how it works. So what do we need to take away from this? Firstly, the top number in the time signature. We haven't talked about the bottom number of the time signature, and we are going to, but we're going to do that on the next section in rhythm. But for now, we need to know that there are going to be 4 beats in each bar. Quarter notes, or crotchets, are 1 beat long. They have a corresponding crotchet or quarter note rest, which is also 1 beat long. Half notes are 2 beats long. They're also referred to as minims, and we have a corresponding half note rest. Whole notes, or semi-breves, are 4 beats long, and we have a corresponding 4 beat rest. The other thing we need to take away from this, we talked about this before, is that these things need to add up. So even though we've got a rest now in place, it still adds up. 1 beat plus 2 beats is 3, plus 1 beat is 4. This rest here is 4 beats all by itself, so it equals the number of beats in the bar. This one here, 2 beats for the half note, plus 2 beats for the half note rest, or half rest, gives us the 4 beats. So everything needs to add up. That's a very important point in music notation. In some more sort of experimental music notations, you don't necessarily have this concept of things having to add up, but you may see examples of that if you're browsing around the internet or so forth. So if you see anything that looks slightly bizarre and that it doesn't seem to add up, just be aware of some of the more modern notation, or not so much modern notation, but experimental notation. You will come across examples like that. For the vast majority of cases, 99.9%, these rules apply. Okay, so that pretty much completes what we're going to do for today. I'm going to come back and talk more about rhythm in a later video. The next video we're going to looks at the concept of intervals. Intervals are basically the distances between 2 notes in terms of pitch. So we're going to be out of time again, and we're going to be back to talking about pitch, but we're going to be talking about more than one note at the same time and how those notes relate to each other. This is the precursor to a concept called harmony, which we're going to move into as well. Okay, so for the moment, that completes this one. As usual, please leave any comments in the comment section, and I'll try and address any questions or comments as quickly as possible. Thanks to everybody who's given me feedback on these so far. That's been very useful. And as I say, I'll be back very soon with the next one on intervals. Thanks very much.